She had 6 children, a broken cart, and 3 miles of blizzard between her and certain death. Margaret Holloway had buried her husband, been thrown off her land, and watched her youngest son stop shivering, which is the moment you stop hoping and start bargaining with whatever's left of your courage. One stranger appeared through the white. One offer. 4 words. And somehow that was enough to begin a war that would drag her through courtrooms, burning barns, and the worst kind of cruelty small-minded men are capable of when they smell money. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels, like if you're staying until the end. The cart had been listing to the left since somewhere around the 2nd-mile marker, the left rear wheel grinding against a crack that Margaret had packed with rags and hope, and neither one of those things was holding anymore. She could hear it with every step, a rhythmic complaint, like the cart itself was asking her how much further, how much more, how long before she admitted this wasn't going to work. She didn't have an answer for a busted wheel. The snow had been coming since mid-afternoon, light at first, the kind that dusts your shoulders and melts before it settles, the kind that fools you into thinking it's harmless. By the time the sun went down behind the mountains, she never actually saw it go, just watched the gray get thicker and darker until there was no difference between sky and ground. It had become something else entirely. It came sideways now, riding a wind off the peaks that had teeth in it, and Margaret leaned into it and pulled the rope tied to the cart's yoke and thought about Caleb. She thought about Caleb because thinking about Caleb was the only thing that kept her feet moving. Caleb was 7. He was wrapped in everything she'd been able to spare, her second coat, 2 wool blankets, a flour sack stuffed with the older children's spare shirts. He was tucked into the cart among what remained of their possessions: a cast iron pot, a bundle of her late husband's tools, 3 changes of clothes per child, the wooden box with James's letters in it, and a small tin of dried beans that would need to last until she figured out where they were going. Caleb had stopped talking an hour ago. Before that, he'd been singing to himself, some nonsense rhyme the older ones had taught him, and Margaret had listened to it and thought, as long as he's singing, we're all right. And then he'd stopped. She'd checked him every quarter-mile after that. The first time, he'd looked up at her and his lips were pale, but he'd blinked and said, "Mama, my feet." "I know, baby. They don't hurt anymore." She'd rubbed his feet through the blanket until her own hands went numb, then tucked them under her arm and walked like that. Rope in one hand, his feet pressed to her ribs. It was awkward and slow, and the cart veered worse without both hands on the yoke, but she kept at it until she felt the blood come back into his toes. And he winced and said it hurt again, and she'd never been so grateful for pain in her life. That had been, she didn't know, 20 minutes ago, maybe longer. Time did strange things in a blizzard. "Mama." This was Clara, 11 years old, walking beside her with her head down and her arm around 9-year-old Thomas, who had stopped complaining about his wet boots around the same time Caleb stopped singing, which worried Margaret in a different way. Thomas always complained. It was his natural state. "Still here," Margaret said. "How far?" That was the question she didn't have the answer to. When Emmett Doyle had put them out of his house that morning, politely, she gave him that. He'd been polite about it, hat in his hands, genuinely sorry-looking, but firm, the bank had told him. The bank had been clear. He couldn't carry them through another winter without the rent. He'd mentioned a settlement called Harrow Creek, said it was maybe 8 miles up the mountain road, said there was a boarding house there. A woman named Pruitt who took in travelers. 8 miles in good weather was a long walk with a loaded cart and 6 children. In a blizzard, with a cracked wheel and no lantern, she'd used the last of the oil that morning to fry the eggs. 8 miles was a thing she wasn't sure had a finish line. Not far, she told Clara. Clara was old enough to know that was a lie. She didn't say anything about it. She just pulled Thomas closer and kept walking. Behind them, Margaret could hear the other 3. 14-year-old Henry, 12-year-old Rose, and 8-year-old Nora, keeping pace. Henry had been quiet all day in that particular way of his, the one where he was thinking hard about something and deciding whether to say it. He was the most like James that way. James used to go quiet before he said something that mattered. She didn't let herself think about James for long. That was a wound she couldn't afford to open out here. "Mama," Henry's voice now just behind her left shoulder. The wheel's getting worse. I hear it. We could leave the tools." "We're not leaving the tools. They're the heaviest." "Henry." She said it quiet, and he stopped. The tools were the only things James had left them that were worth anything practical. She wasn't leaving them on a mountain road to rust under snow. She checked Caleb again. He was lying on his side now, his back to the wind, knees drawn up, blankets over his face. She reached in and touched his cheek through the blanket. Cold. Too cold. Hey. She pushed the blanket back. Caleb, look at me. His eyes opened slowly. In the dark, she couldn't read much from them, but they were open and tracking her, and she exhaled. Sing something, she said. He blinked. That song. The one about the fox. I don't... His voice was thick, slurred at the edges. I don't remember it. Yes, you do. How does it start? He closed his eyes. Caleb, I'm tired, Mama. That was when she felt the fear change shape inside her. It had been fear all day. Fear about the rent, fear about the road, fear about the cold, but it had been a manageable fear, the kind you walk through. This was different. This was the kind that hollows you out. She picked him up out of the cart. He was heavier than he looked, or maybe she was more tired than she'd admitted, but she got him up against her chest and held him with both arms, and the cart rope fell into the snow. Henry. She kept her voice flat. Take the rope. Henry was beside her in an instant, no questions asked, and she heard the cart creak as he took the yoke. She pressed her cheek against Caleb's forehead. His skin was the temperature of the air around them. Talk to me, she said into his hair. Tell me something. Tell me what you're going to eat when we get inside. Nothing. Pancakes? You always say pancakes. Pancakes with the syrup? His head dropped sideways against her shoulder. Caleb. She was walking faster now, or trying to, which was half walking and half stumbling because the road had gotten uneven, somewhere under the snow, and she couldn't feel her feet well enough to trust them. Stay awake, you hear me? That's all I need from you right now. Just stay awake. The wind picked up. That was when she understood that the situation was beyond what she could fix. She'd been fixing things by herself for 14 months, since the day the foreman came to the door with his hat off and told her about the mine. And she was good at it. She'd learned to be good at it. But there were limits to what a woman could fix alone in a blizzard with a dying child in her arms. And she was standing at that limit now, right at the edge of it, looking over. The light appeared without warning. 1 second there was nothing but white dark and wind, and then there was a lantern, orange and swinging, coming toward them through the snow on horseback. Margaret stopped walking. The children clustered around her. She stood there holding Caleb and watched the light come closer and thought, for one strange moment, that she was imagining it. The horse came out of the blizzard like it had been there all along and just decided to become visible. It was a big gray animal, and the man on its back was the kind of large that registered even through a heavy coat, broad across the shoulders, hat pulled low, lantern held out to one side. He pulled up maybe 10 feet away, and the horse stamped, and he looked at them. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was taking them in, the cart, the children, Margaret standing there with a boy in her arms who wasn't moving. That child sick? He said. His voice was low, not unkind. Cold, Margaret said. He stopped responding. The man swung down from the horse in one motion. He came toward her without asking permission, pulled off one glove with his teeth, and pressed his bare fingers to Caleb's neck. Felt for the pulse, she realized. She watched his face while he did it. He had a rough face, weathered, somewhere in his 40s, she guessed. Hard to say in the dark. He wasn't handsome, and he wasn't ugly. He was just a face that had been outside a long time. He's got a pulse, he said. It's slow. I know. You can't walk him to Harrow Creek. That's 2 miles yet, and it's getting worse. He looked at her directly. I've got a ranch a half-mile back. It's not much, but it's warm. She stared at him. Come with me now, he said. 4 words. She turned them over in her mind in the space of 2 seconds, looked at this stranger in a blizzard, looked at the child in her arms, looked at her other 5 children standing in the snow behind her, and made a decision that she would spend a long time afterward not being entirely sure about. All right, she said. His name was Gideon Shaw. She learned that later, inside, when there was light and warmth enough to learn anything. But on that road, in that moment, he was just a man with a lantern, and she followed it. Otatsam. The ranch was not what she expected, which was to say she had no specific expectation because she was too tired and too frightened to form one. But if she'd had to guess, she would have guessed something rougher than what she found. The main house was low and long, built of timber, and it had the look of something that had been built with care and then left to age without it. The roof was solid. The walls were chinked properly. There was a porch with 2 posts that had been repaired at different times with different wood, which told her a great deal without words. Gideon got the door open and held the lantern up, and she carried Caleb inside. The room smelled like wood smoke and something else underneath it. Sawdust, maybe, and the ghost of cooking, and something that took her a moment to identify as the smell of a house that had been clean once and was trying to remember how. There was a stone fireplace along the far wall with coals still orange in it, and she crossed the room and went down on one knee in front of it and laid Caleb on the braided rug there. "More wood," she said, not to anyone in particular. "I've got it." This was Henry, already at the woodbox beside the hearth, loading his arms. Gideon came in behind her with the lantern and 2 of the smaller children and set about building the fire up without being asked. He worked quickly and without waste. She noticed that. He wasn't performing helpfulness. He just did what needed doing. Clara came in with Nora and Thomas. Rose came last, carrying the tin of beans and the wooden box of James's letters, both of which she must have grabbed from the cart without being told. Margaret looked at her eldest daughter and felt something so sharp and complete she couldn't name it. "Door," she said. Rose latched it. The fire caught, and the room changed. Gideon went to a back room and came out with blankets, more than she would have expected him to have, a whole armful, and she began layering them over Caleb, working the boots off first, rubbing his feet the way she'd been doing on the road. His color was bad. His breathing was shallow and quick. "There's a kettle," Gideon said. He was standing near the kitchen side of the room, which was really just a stove and a shelf and a scarred table, not a separate space. "I'll get it on." "Do you have broth? Any kind?" "I've got some dried beef. I can make something." "Please." He moved to the stove. She kept working on Caleb. Thomas, who had been silent and worrying her, chose this moment to start crying. Quietly, which was somehow worse than loudly. He just stood there in the middle of the room and cried with his eyes scrunched closed and his fists at his sides, not making much sound, just leaking. "Tom!" Clara had him before Margaret could get up. "Tom, look, we're inside. Feel how warm it is?" "My boots are wet," he said. "Then we'll dry them." Clara sat him down on the bench along the wall and started working his laces. "Nora, come sit down. Stop standing there like a fence post." Nora, who was 8 and the most literal child Margaret had ever produced, sat down immediately next to Thomas and looked at her feet. Rose sat beside her sister and put an arm around her. Henry was crouched by the fire, feeding it steady, watching his mother work on Caleb with an expression that was too old for 14. It took 40 minutes before Caleb's color started coming back. She knew it was working when he shivered. That was the good sign. When the body got warm enough to fight back, it shivered. She felt his forehead again, checking the same thing with her palm like she didn't trust the first answer. And then Gideon came over and crouched down on the other side of the boy and held out a tin cup. "It's not much," he said. "Beef broth. Not too hot. Thank you." She took it and held it to Caleb's lips. "Caleb, open up." He didn't respond for a moment. Then his mouth opened a little and she tilted a few drops in and watched his throat move. "Good boy." Gideon watched without comment for a moment, then stood and went back to the stove to do something about feeding the rest of them, which she realized she should have thought to ask about, but hadn't, and she was grateful he'd thought of it himself. She stayed on that rug with Caleb until he was warm enough to sleep properly, deep, even breathing, his color back to something she recognized as her son. Then she sat up and looked around the room. The fire was fully going. Her children were in various states of exhaustion, Thomas and Nora asleep on the bench along the wall, Clara curled up in the corner with a blanket around her, still awake but only barely. Henry was sitting at the table eating something from a bowl. Rose sat across from him, the wooden box on her lap, her hands on its lid but not opening it. Gideon was at the stove, his back to the room, working quietly. Margaret pushed herself to her feet and discovered how tired she was. Her legs had a deep ache in them that started at the ankles and went all the way up, the kind of ache that takes several days of not walking to fix. Her hands were stiff. Her face felt raw. She went to the table and sat down, and Gideon turned around and brought a second bowl without asking if she wanted it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He sat down across from her, not directly across, more at the corner, giving her space, and wrapped both hands around his own cup. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought, or maybe just harder worn. There were lines around his eyes and his mouth that weren't purely from squinting in the sun. His hands were the hands of someone who worked. He looked like a man who had gotten used to being quiet. "I don't know how long we'll need to impose," she said. "Don't worry about it tonight. I intend to pay you back somehow. Work, if you need it. My older two are capable." I said, "Don't worry about it tonight." She stopped. She'd been about to keep listing terms, keep negotiating, because that was the habit she'd built over the past 14 months. Never accept anything without offering an exchange. Never let yourself owe too much to anyone. But there was nothing in his voice that required managing. He wasn't holding anything over her. "All right," she said. She ate. The broth was thin, but it was hot, and it was enough. "Shaw," she said after a while. "That's right. I'm Margaret Holloway. These are my children." She listed them: Henry, Clara, Rose, Thomas, Nora, Caleb, and he listened to each name like they mattered, which they did, and she appreciated that. "You were heading to Harrow Creek," he said. "There's a boarding house there. A woman named Pruitt." "There is. She's decent. We were put out of our last place this morning. The family we were staying with, they didn't have a choice. The bank." He nodded. He didn't ask the question that most people would have asked, the one about where her husband was, the one she'd been answering for over a year with a short, flat sentence that was true and final. He just nodded, like the situation was self-evident, which it was. "My husband died in a mining accident 14 months ago," she said anyway. She preferred to say it herself rather than wait for it to be asked. "James Holloway. He was working a silver mine out of Cartwright. A shaft collapse." "I'm sorry. We had a house in Cartwright, but it was company property, so—" She stopped. There was no need to explain the rest. "And James's family, his brother Victor, has been—" She stopped again. She was too tired to get into Victor. "We've been moving for about 7 months, finding work where we can." 6 children, Gideon said. He wasn't saying it like it was an accusation, just like he was putting together a picture. "I know," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, something wry and brief. "I wasn't saying it like it was a problem. Most people say it that way." "Most people," he said, "are not very useful." She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at her bowl. Outside, the wind was beating against the house, but the walls were holding. She slept that night on the floor near Caleb, because she wasn't going to be more than 3 feet from him until she was sure he was past the worst of it. Gideon had given her one of the 2 bedrooms. The other one was his, and she had the impression from the way he'd opened its door and stood aside that he didn't open it often for himself. There was a bed in there, neatly made, and she'd gotten the 3 youngest into it and taken the floor without debate. She woke twice in the night to check Caleb. Both times he was breathing deep and warm, and she went back to sleep. In the morning, the storm was still going, heavy and gray outside the single window. She woke to the sound of Henry moving around in the main room and came out to find that her son had built the fire up again and was attempting to figure out how the stove worked with an expression of serious concentration that made him look so much like his father that she had to look away for a second. "The flue," she said. "You need to open it more." "I did, I think." She crossed to him and adjusted the flue herself, and the stove draft improved immediately. Henry stood back and watched. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some." "Liar." He almost smiled. "Maybe some." The others came out in stages. Caleb first, shuffling in with blankets still around his shoulders, looking sheepish and slightly mystified by his own weakness, the way children do when they've been frightened but recovered and don't quite know what to do with having been frightened. Margaret held him for a moment and felt his forehead and said nothing about it, just held him. Gideon came in from outside an hour later, stomping snow off his boots on the porch, coat white across the shoulders. He'd been feeding the animals. She could tell from the smell of hay and cold on him. He looked at the children arranged around his main room and at Margaret standing at his stove attempting to make something useful from the provisions she found in his pantry, and his expression did that thing again, that near, not quite a smile. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Corn porridge," she said. "If that's all right." He took off his coat. That's fine. She was looking at his face now that there was light to see it clearly. She revised her earlier estimate. He wasn't in his 40s, closer to late 30s, maybe 40. The weathering was from the work, not the years. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized but couldn't immediately place, like a thing she'd seen before in a different form. Then Thomas did something clumsy with a cup, and it fell off the table and shattered, and Thomas froze, his face going white, and Margaret looked at him and said, "It's all right, pick up the big pieces carefully," and looked at Gideon, bracing herself for whatever came next. He picked the broom up from beside the door. "I've got it," he said. Thomas was still frozen. "It's a cup," Gideon said, without particular heat, crouching down to sweep. "I've got 6 more. That was when she placed it." The stillness, the economy of reaction. He was a man who had learned how to be quiet around broken things. Someone had taught him that, or something had, and not gently. She went back to the porridge. The storm held for 3 days. 3 days of wind and white, and the whole world reduced to the yard and the barn and the house and the space between them. Margaret had expected it to be unbearable. 6 children in a strange man's house, crowded, restless, tension building the way it does when people are trapped in small spaces. Instead, it was something else. Henry started helping with the livestock by the end of the first day. He just followed Gideon out to the barn that afternoon and wasn't told to go back, so he stayed. By the second day, he was doing half the chores without being asked. Gideon watched him work and said little, but his watching had a different quality than dismissal. Rose discovered the shelves of mended harness and tack in the back room and started restitching a bridle that was coming apart because Rose had learned leather work from James, and she couldn't sit idle when there was something fixable in front of her. Clara managed the younger ones with the brisk efficiency of a child who had been managing younger ones since she could walk. She organized them into a corner with a story she invented as she went, something involving a lost horse and a mountain spirit, and Margaret privately thought it was better than half the published books she'd ever read, and Caleb recovered. By the afternoon of the second day, he was underfoot and asking questions about everything in the house and getting in the way with the cheerful obliviousness of a 7-year-old who had entirely forgotten that he'd nearly died, which was, Margaret thought, the greatest mercy in the world. She worked. It was what she did. She cooked and cleaned and mended and organized, and when she found the state of Gideon's kitchen supplies, adequate but haphazard, a man buying provisions without much thought about how they fit together, she reorganized them in a way that made sense and said nothing about it. He didn't say anything either, but she noticed that he used the system. On the second evening, the children were asleep, and she and Gideon sat at the table with the fire burning down, and she said, "Tell me about your ranch. What do you run?" He took a moment before answering. "Cattle. Used to be more. The herd's down to about 60 head. What happened?" Another pause. "Hard years." She looked at him. He had his hands around a coffee cup that he wasn't drinking from, just holding. "How long have you been here?" 11 years. "Alone?" He looked up at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have asked that." "It's all right." He looked back at his cup. "I had a wife and a daughter. My daughter was 3. Fever took them both 5 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "You lose people," he said, in a tone that wasn't acceptance exactly, more like a thing you say when acceptance is the only option left. "You figure out how to keep going." "Yes," she said, "you do." They sat with that for a while, which was a different kind of sitting than silence usually was. Outside, the wind was easing for the first time in 2 days. "The ranch needs work," she said, not as an observation about his failures, just as a fact she'd been cataloging. "The south fence, the one I can see from the window, the posts are heeled over. The chicken coop needs a new roof. I know what it needs," he said. Not sharp about it, just direct. "My children are good workers," she said. "If you let us stay until the road's clear, we'll earn it." He looked at her for a long time. "The roads are going to be closed at least another week. Maybe 2. Then we'll have time to get a start on the fence." Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it exactly. "You don't stop, do you?" he said. "Not much point in stopping." He nodded slowly. "All right then, what?" The roads cleared on the 9th day, and by then the south fence had 3 new posts, and the chicken coop had half a new roof, and Margaret had cooked 11 dinners in Gideon Shaw's kitchen and learned which burner ran hot, and that he took his coffee black but would accept a little sugar if it was offered, and that the quiet of the house at night was not a comfortable quiet, but the other kind. She could have gone to Harrow Creek. Pruitt's boarding house was there, and maybe work, and the boarding house would at least be a definite situation instead of whatever this was. She stayed. She told herself it was because Caleb wasn't entirely himself yet, which was true, but not the whole truth. She told herself it was because Henry and Gideon had the fence half done, and it seemed wasteful to leave it, which was also true, but not the whole truth. The truth that she didn't say aloud was something simpler and harder to manage. For the first time in 14 months, her children had been inside a house that felt like it might become something, and she was not ready yet to break that. 3 miles away, in the town of Harrow Creek, people were already beginning to talk. She heard it first from Clara, who had walked into town with Henry for flour and come back with something that sat wrong on her face. "What?" Margaret said. "Nothing." "Clara." Her daughter set the flour sack down on the table with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Gaunt at the store was talking to someone. She didn't know I could hear. She was saying—" Clara stopped. "Things about you. About why we're here." "What kind of things?" Clara pressed her lips together. She was 11, and she knew what reputation meant, and she knew her mother had already lost too much to lose that too. "That you came to the Shaw Ranch on purpose," she said finally. That you arranged it to get yourself settled somewhere." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She heard it, and she felt the particular burn of it. Not surprised, because she'd known something like this was coming, but the burn of it anyway, the way it always burned no matter how expected. "Who is Mrs. Gaunt?" she said. "The woman at the general store. She's wide, red hair going gray, about this tall, talks fast?" "Yes." "I know the type," Margaret said. "How many people were in the store?" Clara looked miserable. 4 or 5. "Did Henry hear?" He acted like he didn't. Margaret looked at her daughter, at the way she was holding herself, rigid and careful, the way she got when she was trying not to show how much something had landed. She crossed to her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Look at me," she said. Clara looked up. "People talk," Margaret said. "They talk because they're frightened and because someone else's life confuses them and because it's easier than doing anything useful. It's got nothing to do with who we are. But if they think, I know what they think, I know exactly what they think." She squeezed her daughter's shoulder once and let go. "And I know what's true? Do you?" A pause, then, "Yes." "Good, that's what matters." But alone that night, after the children were asleep and the fire was low, she sat at the table and thought about Mrs. Gaunt's words and the 4 or 5 people in the store, and the way that kind of talk moved through a small town like water, through dry ground, following every low place, filling every gap, finding its way into places you never expected. It had been 9 days. She had 11 miles between her and whatever came next, and she was sitting in a dead woman's kitchen feeling something she had no right to feel and no way to explain and absolutely no time for. She needed to figure out what was real and what was manageable and what she was actually doing here. She was still sitting there when she heard the floor creak, and Gideon came through from the back, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He stopped when he saw her at the table. He had a lantern. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "No." He set the lantern down and sat at the corner of the table the way he did, giving her space. He didn't ask anything. He just sat. After a while, she said, "People in town are talking." "I expected that," he said. "You expected it." Small towns. He wasn't dismissive about it, just factual. Give it a little time. "And if it doesn't stop?" He looked at her steadily. "Then we handle it." She was about to ask him what that meant, but she didn't because she wasn't ready for that conversation, and he didn't seem to be pushing it. She picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold. "You're good with them," he said after a while. "Your children." "I love them." "That's not the same thing." She thought about that. "No, I suppose it isn't." "Henry's smart," he said. "He works like he's trying to prove something." "He is," she said. "He thinks he's the man of the family now. He's been thinking it for 14 months. He's 14. I know, I keep telling him. Gideon wrapped both hands around his cup and was quiet for a moment. My daughter, he said slowly, would have been 8 this spring. She didn't say anything. She just let that sit. I used to think... He stopped. Started again, more carefully. I used to think you patch things up and you keep going. That's what you do. He looked at the fire. But the ranch got quiet, and it just stayed that way. Until now, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. Until now, she said again, which wasn't a question. He didn't answer it, which was also an answer. 10 days after the night she'd carried Caleb through the blizzard, a letter arrived for Margaret Holloway, care of the Harrow Creek Post Office, from an attorney in Butte named Mercer Foss. She hadn't told anyone she was at the Shaw Ranch, which meant someone in town had told him, which meant people were paying attention in ways she hadn't accounted for. She read the letter twice standing on the road outside the post office because her legs stopped working properly on the first read-through. It was about land. James apparently had filed a claim on 30 acres of hill country east of Cartwright 3 years before his death. It had been in the back of a drawer somewhere, unrecorded for reasons she didn't understand yet. Foss had been engaged, by whom, the letter didn't say clearly, to look into the status of the claim. The land itself, Foss wrote, had recently been surveyed by a mining interest out of Chicago. She had to read the next part 3 times. The survey had revealed a significant copper deposit. Significant, the letter said, was perhaps understating the matter. She stood on the frozen road outside the Harrow Creek post office and held the letter, and her hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Somewhere, she knew, before she'd even finished reading, that Victor Holloway was already moving. Victor Holloway had their mother's eyes and none of her patience, and he'd been waiting for something like this for a long time. Margaret knew that before she finished reading the letter. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually changes. Some shift in the air, some drop in pressure, something that makes the animals restless. Victor had never liked James. That was the polite way of saying it. The accurate way was that Victor had spent 20 years watching his younger brother get things Victor felt belonged to him. The family's good opinion, the farm before their parents died, a wife who was worth something, children who were healthy. Victor had a talent for calculating what other people had that he didn't, and a corresponding talent for finding reasons those people didn't deserve it. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the ranch. Mercer Foss, the attorney, had been careful with his language, but the outline was there if you read it straight. James had filed a claim on 30 acres of hill country that nobody had thought was worth much. He'd paid the filing fee out of money he'd apparently been setting aside without telling her about, which was James all over. He never worried out loud, never burdened her with what-ifs, just quietly prepared for things and said nothing until there was something definite to say. He'd died before there was anything definite, and the claim had sat in a drawer in the mining office at Cartwright, unrecorded properly, for 14 months. Until somebody put a survey team on that hill country. And now a Chicago mining interest was looking at it, and Mercer Foss was writing letters, and somewhere in all of that, Victor Holloway had learned that his dead brother's widow might be sitting on something significant. She told Gideon that evening after the children were in bed. She spread the letter on the table, and he read it twice without saying anything, which was his way when something required thinking. Copper, he said, when he put it down. That's what it says. Significant deposit. That's the word he used. Gideon sat back in his chair and looked at the letter like it was a thing that might move if he stopped watching it. And you didn't know about any of this. I knew James filed claims sometimes. He talked about prospecting like other men talk about fishing, something to do on the side, something that might come to something and probably wouldn't. I didn't keep track of which ones. She paused. I should have kept better track. You were managing 6 children and a household. That's not an excuse for not knowing what my husband was filing in the county office. He didn't argue with her about it, which was the right call. She wasn't looking to be told it wasn't her fault. She was looking at a letter and figuring out what came next, and those were different problems. Who's Victor Holloway? He said. She took a moment. There were several ways to answer that question, most of them uncharitable, but all of them accurate. James's older brother, she said. He and James they didn't get along. After James died, Victor came around twice. The first time to offer condolences, the second time to suggest that I wasn't capable of raising 6 children on my own, and that he and his wife could take the two youngest to help lighten my burden. She said, lighten my burden the way you say something that tastes bad. I told him no. He didn't like that. And now he knows about the land. Someone told him, or he found out some other way. She tapped the letter once. Foss doesn't say who engaged him. That means whoever engaged him didn't want me to know immediately. They wanted to see what I'd do first. Gideon looked at her. You think like a lawyer. I think like a woman who's been underestimated by men for 40 years, she said. It's similar. He almost smiled at that. Almost. What do you want to do? He said. I need to write back to Foss, find out exactly who hired him and what they're actually after. And I need to talk to someone in Cartwright who can pull the original claim filing and tell me what James's claim actually covers legally. That's a day's ride to Cartwright. I know. He looked at the table. Outside, the wind had finally died down to something manageable, and the snow had stopped that afternoon for the first time in days. Roads should be passable by morning, he said. I know a man in Cartwright who does deed work. Honest enough, as those things go. She looked at him. You'd come with me. The children can't go, and you can't leave them here alone. Henry's 14 and good with livestock and not good with whatever trouble might show up from the direction of Victor Holloway. He said it without dramatics, just as a logistical fact. I'll come with you. We'll leave Henry in charge. He can handle a morning. She didn't argue. Not because she couldn't, but because he was right and she knew it. And she was too tired to argue against things that were right. She wrote back to Foss that night by lamplight, a careful letter, polite and unrevealing, asking for clarity on who had retained him and requesting a copy of any survey documentation. Then she sat for a while after the letter was sealed and looked at the fire and thought about James filing that claim on a piece of hill country and not saying a word about it, just squirreling away filing fees from his mining wages, patient and quiet. And she felt the grief of him in a way she hadn't let herself feel it in months. Not as a wound this time, but as something rounder and less raw. The particular sadness of understanding someone too late, of seeing the whole shape of them only after they were gone. She went to bed and lay in the dark for a while and listened to her children breathe. The ride to Cartwright took 3 hours in cold that had teeth, but no malice. Clear sky, hard ground, the kind of winter morning that's brutal but honest about it. Gideon's horses were strong and sure-footed on the iced road, and he rode without conversation, which suited her because she was running figures and timelines in her head and didn't have room for talk. She was also watching him, off and on, in the sideways way you watch someone when you're trying to decide something. He hadn't had to offer to come. He hadn't had to do any of it. Take them in, feed them, let them stay past the first 3 days, let Henry work beside him like a second set of hands, sit at the table in the evenings, and let the house feel less like a place where things had died. He'd done all of it without making her feel like she owed him something specific, which was rarer than it should have been. She thought about the daughter he'd said would have been 8 this spring. She thought about the neat bed in the room he barely used. She turned her attention back to the road. The deed man in Cartwright was named Orville Prudhomme, and he worked out of a back office behind the assay office, a small room that smelled of old paper and tobacco and the particular staleness of records that don't get looked at often enough. He was a thin man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a way of pulling documents out of their folders that was almost reverential, like he thought paper was the most important thing in the world, which in his line of work, it mostly was. He found James's claim in 12 minutes. Holloway, James R., he said, spreading it on the desk. Filed 3 years back. November. 32 acres. Hill country east of Cartwright. Surveyed from... He traced a line with one finger. Here to here. He tapped the rough map attached to the document. It's valid. Properly filed, properly witnessed. And the current survey? Margaret said. Prudhomme's expression shifted into something more careful. You'll have heard about that then. I received a letter. The Chicago company, they're called Dalton Mineral, they surveyed that parcel about 6 weeks ago, filed preliminary results with the Territory Mining Office in Helena. He paused. I've seen the preliminary. The deposit is real. How significant is significant, Gideon said. Prudhomme looked at him, then at Margaret. If the preliminary holds up through full extraction survey, and the man who ran it has a good reputation, you're looking at a copper vein that could produce for 20 or 30 years. The income from leasing rights alone. He stopped. Say the number, Margaret said. He said it. She sat very still for a moment. Gideon said nothing, but she could feel him go still beside her. That's leasing rights only, Prudhomme said. If you negotiated a percentage of extraction, who else knows what the deposit is worth? She said. Dalton Mineral knows. They would have been very interested in acquiring the claim before the preliminary results became public record. He straightened the document on his desk. Someone at the Territorial Mining Office also knows. Information has a way of moving, she said. Yes. She thought about the letter from Foss, about who had engaged him and why they hadn't said. Is there any way for someone to challenge the claim? To say it wasn't properly filed, or that the filer didn't have the right? Challenges happen, Prudhomme said carefully. Especially when the land turns out to be worth something. There are various legal mechanisms. A challenge to the original filing, which would be difficult given this is properly registered. He folded his hands on the desk. More commonly, someone challenges the heir's right to inherit. Questions of estate, of family circumstance, of guardianship, she said. He looked at her. If someone claimed that the children were James Holloway's rightful heirs, which they are, and then moved to establish guardianship over the children, then the guardian would control the estate, Prudhomme finished. He said it quietly. The room was very still. How soon could that kind of claim move through the courts, she said. Depends on the judge. Depends on how well-funded the claimant is. A man with enough money to hire the right lawyers. He stopped. Weeks. Maybe less if someone pushed hard. Margaret looked at the claim document spread on the desk. 32 acres of hill country that James had spent his own money to file on without telling her, saving up for it the way he saved up for everything he believed in. Quietly, patiently, without knowing he wouldn't be there to see what it came to. I want a copy of this filed with 3 separate offices, she said. Whatever you can do to make it harder to challenge or lose. That's a good instinct, Prudhomme said, and I want the name of a good attorney, not Foss. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the ride out. The ride out had been thinking. The ride back was heavier than that. You heard the number, she said, about a mile from the ranch. I heard it, Gideon said. It changes things. It does. She looked at the road ahead. Before that letter, I was trying to figure out how to make $15 stretch to spring. Now I'm trying to figure out how to keep Victor from taking my children to get at a copper mine. I know. It's the same problem, really. It's just been... She searched for the word. Clarified. He looked at her sideways. Is that what you call it? What would you call it? He thought for a moment. A fire. She considered that. Fair. What are you going to do? What I have to. Get an attorney, document everything. Make it very clear to every relevant authority that those children have a mother who is alive and capable and not going anywhere. She paused. And stay somewhere defensible. He was quiet. I know that's asking more than what you signed up for, she said. Taking in a widow and 6 children is one thing. Taking in a widow who's about to have a legal war dropped on her is something different. He rode for a while without answering. The ranch came into view at the next curve, the low, long house, the barn, the south fence with its 3 new posts standing straight against the white. You're good for the ranch, he said finally. She looked at him. The children, the work they do. Henry knows cattle better than I gave him credit for. He kept his eyes on the road. And you run a kitchen better than I do, which is not saying much, but it's something. That's not an answer, she said. It's as close as I've got right now. She decided to take it. Back at the ranch, the children had managed the morning adequately, which meant Thomas had gotten into something he shouldn't have. The chickens had gotten out of the coop through the gap in the half-repaired roof, and Caleb had somehow acquired a splinter the size of a small nail in his left palm, which Clara had already dealt with by the time Margaret and Gideon returned, in a manner that had involved tears from Caleb and impressive forbearance from Clara. He walked into the woodpile, Clara said by way of explanation. I was checking it, Caleb said with dignity. You don't check a woodpile with your hand, Henry said. I needed to see if it was solid. Margaret looked at her youngest son's bandaged palm, then at his face, which was trying very hard to look unbothered. She kissed the top of his head and went to put the kettle on. The normalcy of it, the chickens, the splinter, Thomas with wood chips in his hair from whatever he'd been doing with the axe, Rose reading at the table with her boots off and her feet tucked under her. The normalcy of it worked on her like medicine. She needed it. She needed to stand in the middle of all this ordinary chaos and feel the weight of it and know that this was what she was fighting for. Not a copper deposit, not a number she'd heard in a lawyer's back office, but this. These particular people in this particular room irritating each other in their particular ways. She started the tea and thought about Victor. Victor had a wife named Dora who did whatever Victor told her to do, and 2 children of his own who Margaret had met twice and found perfectly nice and entirely overshadowed. He had money, not a great deal, but enough to hire someone competent. He had patience, in the way that men who feel wronged have patience, which is really just resentment that's been aging long enough to think of itself as strategy. He also had something she didn't, which was time. Victor's life would not be disrupted by a legal fight. Her life was already disrupted by everything. She thought about Prudhomme saying weeks, maybe less. She thought about the attorney he'd recommended, a woman in Butte named Celia Brandt, which had surprised her, and Prudhomme had said, "She's the best mining law attorney in the territory. Victor Holloway is going to hire someone who underestimates you. Best to hire someone who won't." That was worth remembering. That evening she wrote 2 more letters. One to Celia Brandt, direct and factual, who she was, what the claim was, what she expected Victor to do, and what she needed. One to the Territorial Mining Office in Helena, formally registering herself as James Holloway's widow and the heir to his estate and all filed claims therein. Henry watched her write from across the table. He did that sometimes, watched her work with an attention that made her wonder what he was trying to learn. "You're not scared," he said. She kept writing. "I am scared." "You don't look it." "I've learned not to look it." She finished the sentence she was on and looked up. Being scared isn't the problem. Being scared and stopping is the problem. Henry turned this over. "What are we going to do if he comes? We're going to be ready for him." "How?" "Good attorneys, good records, and people who know us and can say what they've seen." She put the pen down and looked at her son. 14 years old, his father's jaw and her mother's eyes, trying so hard to be older than he was. "You're not responsible for this, Henry. This isn't something you have to fix. But if something happens, I'm handling it. You're allowed to just be 14. He looked like he didn't believe her. She didn't entirely blame him. 3 days later, a man from Harrow Creek named Rufus Kane came to the ranch to buy a horse from Gideon. He was polite about it, paid fair, and when he was leaving, he turned at the gate and said, "You should know there's a man been in town 2 days asking questions about you, Mrs. Holloway. He's staying at the Creek Hotel, asking about the children, about the claim, about—" He stopped. "About the Shaw Ranch." Margaret stood on the porch and kept her face still. "What does he look like?" "Heavy man, 40, maybe 45. He's got a lawyer with him." She knew before she asked. "His name?" Rufus Kane turned his hat over in his hands. "He said his name was Victor Holloway, said he was family." She watched Rufus ride out. Then she turned and went back inside. Gideon was at the stove. He'd heard every word through the open door. He turned and looked at her. "All right," she said. Not to him exactly. More to herself, to the situation, to whatever came next. "All right," she said again, quieter. The fire crackled. Outside, the sky was going dark fast, the way it did in Montana in winter, like someone pulling a shade. Somewhere in Harrow Creek, Victor Holloway was having dinner at a hotel and planning what he thought was going to be simple. Margaret Holloway sat down at the table and started writing another letter. The letter she wrote that night was to Celia Brandt in Butte, and she wrote it like a woman who understood that every word she put on paper might eventually be read aloud in a courtroom. She wrote it 3 times. The first version was too angry. She could feel the anger bleeding through the sentences, making them jagged and short in ways that would tell whoever read them more about her emotional state than about her legal position, and she couldn't afford that. The second version was too careful. She drained the life out of it trying to drain the anger, and it came out flat and vague, which was its own kind of weakness. The third version was the one she kept. Factual, specific, clear about what Victor had filed, what he wanted, and what she needed Celia Brandt to understand before they spoke in person. She sealed it and set it beside the door to go out with the Morning Post writer. Gideon didn't comment on the 3 drafts she'd crumpled and thrown in the fire. He'd been working at the other end of the table, mending a length of rope, and he'd stayed quiet through all of it in a way she'd come to recognize as a particular form of respect, not the kind that pretends not to notice, but the kind that notices and decides it's none of its business unless asked. "I need to go to Harrow Creek tomorrow," she said. He looked up. "Not to see Victor," she said. "I need to talk to the postmaster about the Helena filing, and I need to find out from someone reliable what Victor's lawyer has been saying around town." "Who's reliable?" She thought about it. "Rufus Kane seems straight." "He is. His wife more so." Gideon set down the rope. "Ada Kane knows everything that moves through that town. Not a gossip, she just pays attention." "Would she talk to me? I can ask." She nodded. Then, "You don't have to come tomorrow. I can manage the ride." "I know you can manage the ride, Ma," he said, in a tone that settled the question without making an argument of it. She didn't push back. Ada Kane was a small woman with a direct way of looking at you that made you feel like you were being measured for something, which Margaret found refreshing after 2 weeks of being looked at sideways. She met them at the door of the Kane house, already expecting them, it seemed. Rufus must have ridden ahead, and brought them inside without ceremony, past a front room crowded with the evidence of a full life, mismatched chairs and a basket of mending and a pair of small boots muddy by the door. "Sit down," Ada said. "I'll get coffee, and I'll tell you what I know, which is enough to be useful." She poured and she talked, and she was indeed useful. Victor's attorney was a man named Prescott from Butte, and he'd been in Harrow Creek for 4 days asking about Margaret's circumstances, her living situation, her finances, the condition of the children, whether she was properly settled. He'd spoken to the gaunt woman at the general store, to the owner of the Creek Hotel, to 2 men who'd been at the post office when Henry came in for the flour. He'd been careful about it, Ada said, framing everything as concern for the children's welfare, which was the most dangerous kind of question because it sounded reasonable. "What's he saying about Gideon?" Margaret asked. Ada set down her cup. "That the arrangement is improper. That a widow living on a single man's property without family around is not a suitable environment for children." Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He's using the gossip," Margaret said. "He didn't start it," Ada said, "but he's certainly using it. And some people are," she paused, choosing, "receptive, because they don't know you, because it's a hard winter and people look for things to talk about. It's not malice, most of it. It's just people." "People," Margaret said flatly. "I know how it sounds. I know how it is." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it was something to hold on to. "What about the claim? Has Prescott said anything publicly about the land?" "Nothing direct. He's been asking about the children specifically, their schooling, their health, whether they seem well cared for. Standard guardianship language." Ada looked at her evenly. "He filed a petition, day before yesterday. I have a friend at the courthouse who told Rufus." The room was very quiet. "Custody of all 6? Margaret said. "All 6. On grounds that their mother is financially unstable and living in circumstances that—" Ada glanced at Gideon briefly, then back. "The petition uses the phrase morally questionable arrangement. That's the language." Gideon's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Margaret set her cup down carefully. "When is the hearing?" 3 weeks. Judge Aldrich out of Billings is writing the circuit. 3 weeks. It was enough time to do something with, but only if she started immediately. She looked at Ada Kane, at this woman who'd met her an hour ago, and was sitting here giving her the kind of direct, useful information that most people in Margaret's experience didn't offer until they'd known you for years and decided you'd earned it. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked. Ada picked up her cup again. "Because I've had my own versions of men like Victor Holloway," she said simply. "And I had people who helped me, and I never forgot it." They rode back with the cold getting into the edges of the afternoon, and Margaret spent the ride thinking in the practical, forward-looking way she'd trained herself to think when the situation required it. Not about how unfair it was, not about the burn of morally questionable arrangement still working on her from the inside, but about what came next and what she could control. Celia Brandt needed to know about the petition immediately. The hearing date, the judge's name, the specific language of the filing. Margaret needed affidavits, people who could speak to her character, her capability, the condition of the children. Ada Kane would likely give one. Rufus. Prudhomme perhaps, since he'd seen her handle the land documentation with clear-headedness. The children themselves might be asked to testify, which was a thing she wouldn't allow if she could avoid it, but needed to prepare for if she couldn't. She also needed to think about money. A competent attorney in a mining rights case that was dressed up as a custody battle was not cheap, and the irony was that the land itself, the land that was causing all of this, was not yet producing anything. The money was theoretical. The legal fight was immediate and real. "I have some things I can sell," she said, more to herself than to Gideon. "What things?" he said. "James's pocket watch. A brooch of my mother's." She looked at the road. "It's enough to retain Celia Brant, maybe, if she's reasonable about the initial fee." "I have money set aside," Gideon said. She looked at him sharply. "Not a great deal, but some." "Gideon, I know what you're going to say." "Then you know why I can't take it." "You're not taking it," he said. "I'm offering it. There's a difference." He kept his eyes on the road. "And before you say something about owing, it's not a gift. It's a loan. You're going to have money from that land eventually. This is a bridge." "A bridge?" "Just until Brant gets started." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She rode for a while with the cold and the creak of saddle leather and thought about what it meant to let someone build a bridge for you, and whether you had the right to refuse it when refusing it might cost your children everything. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. That was enough for now. Victor came to the ranch 4 days later. She'd known he would come in person eventually. He was the kind of man who needed to look at what he was taking before he took it, needed to feel the weight of the situation in his own hands. He came in a hired buggy with Prescott beside him, and a third man she didn't recognize sitting in the back with the posture of someone who wrote things down for a living. She was on the porch when they pulled up. She'd been churning butter, which was not the most dignified thing to be doing when your enemy arrived, but she didn't go inside. She kept churning. Victor stepped down from the buggy and looked at the ranch with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. He was heavier than she remembered. James had been lean, runner lean, always moving, always restless. Victor had settled into himself differently. He had the look of a man who'd spent years being right about things and had never quite recovered from the pleasure of it. "Margaret," he said, cordial, hat in hand. "You're looking well." "Victor." She set the churn aside and straightened. "You should have written first." "I did write, through Foss. That wasn't a letter to me. That was a letter designed to find out how much I knew." She came down 1 porch step, but not 2, kept the height. "What do you want?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recalibration, like he'd expected something softer and was adjusting. Prescott stood slightly behind and to his right, with a leather case under his arm and the professionally blank face of a man being paid to listen. "I want to talk about the children," Victor said, "about their welfare. Margaret, you've been living out of a cart." "I've been living on a working ranch," she said, "which has a house and a kitchen and food on the table and 6 children who are healthy and in good order, which you're welcome to verify by asking any of them. The circumstances of the arrangement are none of your business. A court might disagree. A court might." She held his gaze. "Was there something specific you wanted to say, Victor? Or did you come all the way from wherever you've been staying to tell me things I've already read in your attorney's filing?" Victor looked at Prescott. Prescott's face stayed blank. "James would have wanted the children properly provided for," Victor said, and he said it with the particular confidence of a man who knows the person he's invoking isn't around to disagree. Something went cold and tight in her chest. She took a breath through it. "James provided for them," she said. "He filed that claim because he was thinking about their future. It's their inheritance. And you know that, Victor. You know exactly what that land is worth, and you know it belongs to his children, not to you, which is the only reason you're standing on this porch." A beat of silence. "The land isn't worth anything yet," Victor said. "It's a claim, not a mine. And a widow who can't pay her rent is not in a position to develop—" "I have an attorney," she said. "Her name is Celia Brant. You can speak to her from here on." Victor's expression did something then that she hadn't expected, not anger, but something more like calculation, The kind that means the conversation has gone differently than planned, and a person is filing that information away for later use. He nodded once, very slowly. "All right," he said. He walked back to the buggy. Prescott followed. The note-taker followed. She stood on the porch and watched them go and kept her face entirely still until the buggy was past the gate, and then she went inside and sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the wood surface and waited for the shaking in her arms to stop. Henry was in the doorway to the back room. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "You did good, Mama," he said. "I don't know that," she said. "You didn't back down." Not backing down and winning are different things. She looked up at him. "Don't let the little ones know he was here. Not yet." Henry nodded. "Yeah, Mom." The weeks that followed had a quality of dread that she learned to carry the way you carry something heavy on a long walk, by not thinking about the weight of it, by thinking instead about the next step and the one after that. Celia Brandt responded to her letter within a week. A sharp, precise response that asked exactly the right questions and said, "I've dealt with Prescott before. He's good, but he's used to opposing people who are frightened, and frightened people make mistakes. Don't be frightened. Be thorough." Margaret read that sentence 4 times and then folded the letter into the wooden box with James's letters, which was where she kept the things that mattered. Brandt came out from Butte 2 weeks before the hearing, arriving on the stage with a leather case and a practical coat, and a way of taking stock of a room in the first 30 seconds that Margaret recognized as a professional habit, same as her own. She was perhaps 50, with gray hair she wore back without fuss, and she sat at Gideon's table and spread the documents out, and went through them with a methodical patience that was deeply reassuring. "The claim is solid," she said. "Prudhomme did good work getting it triple registered. Victor can't challenge the filing itself without looking ridiculous." She tapped Prescott's petition. "This is the attack. They'll argue you're unstable. They'll point to the months of transience, moving from place to place, no fixed address, no consistent schooling for the children. They'll use the language about the arrangement here." She glanced up. "Are you prepared to speak to that directly?" "I can speak to anything directly," Margaret said. Brandt looked at Gideon. "And you?" "What do you need from me?" he said. "The truth, same as her. What this household is, what it isn't, how long it's been operating, and whether a judge looking at it sees stability or something he can be persuaded is improper." She was direct about it, not unkind. "Prescott is going to try to make this look like it's about the children. It's about the land. Aldrich is a reasonable man, but he's not immune to a well-told story. Our story needs to be better told." "What's our story?" Margaret asked. "A woman who lost her husband, kept her family together through extraordinary difficulty, found stable housing and community, and is being targeted by a family member who wants the mineral rights to land that was legally filed by her husband for the benefit of her children." Brandt stacked the documents and squared their edges. "That's the truth. We just need the courtroom to see it." It was Nora who first smelled the smoke. The night was 11 days before the hearing, and it was the kind of cold that came with a clear sky. Stars hard and close and no cloud cover to hold any warmth in. The children were all asleep. Gideon had gone to bed an hour earlier. Margaret was at the table with Brandt's notes spread in front of her, going over the list of witnesses for the 4th time that week, when Nora appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, small and still half asleep, with her nose wrinkled. "Mama, something smells wrong." Margaret lifted her head. She smelled it then. The wood smoke that was always there at the edges, but underneath it, something sharper. Something that wasn't the fireplace. She was moving before she'd consciously made the decision to move. She got to the window and looked out, and the barn was on fire. Not the cautious beginning of a fire. Not a lamp tipped over. Not a spark catching slow. The south corner of the barn was fully going, orange and roaring, lit up against the black sky like something that had been burning for longer than she'd been asleep. And in the yard, caught in the light of it, there were 2 men on horses, and a 3rd man on foot, closer to the house. "Henry." She had her voice down to a low, hard tone, crossing back to the bedroom doorway. "Henry, get up. Get everyone up and stay inside. Don't come out." Henry was already awake. "The barn. I see it. Stay inside." She turned to Nora. "Go with Henry. Right now. Stay together." She went to the corner of the room where Gideon kept his rifle, and it wasn't there. He'd taken it to the barn that afternoon to, she remembered, to deal with something he'd seen in the hayloft. She looked around and found the shotgun on the wall, the one she'd noticed but never touched. Loaded or unloaded, she didn't know. She took it down, broke it open. 2 shells. She snapped it closed. Gideon's door opened and he came out pulling his coat on, looked at her, looked at the window, read the situation in about 2 seconds. There are 3 of them, she said. 2 on horses, 1 near the house. The rifle's in the barn. I know. I'll go around. The man near the house will see you before you get to the barn. She held out the shotgun. Take this. You take it, he said. I know how to use it. I know you do. Take it anyway. He was already at the door, pulling it open, looking out at the angle she couldn't see from the window. She didn't argue. She took the shotgun and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a wall. The fire was louder outside, a working sound, a consuming sound, the barn's timber catching and going with the kind of violence that had nothing personal about it, but felt personal anyway. The horses in the yard were shifting, unsettled by the noise and light. The 2 men on horseback were facing the house. The 3rd man was standing about 30 feet from the porch. He was holding something she couldn't immediately identify in the firelight. Mrs. Holloway, he said. He had a carrying voice, a man used to being heard. We're not here to hurt anyone. We need you to come with us and sign some papers. Who sent you? She said. We just need you to sign. Who sent you? Not a question the second time. The man shifted his weight. In the firelight, she could see him better now. Heavy coat, hat down low. The posture of someone who'd done this kind of job before and didn't enjoy the part where the person talked back. We're going to need you to put that down, he said, looking at the shotgun. No, she said. One of the men on horseback moved his horse forward a step. Don't, she said, and she leveled the shotgun, and the specific quality of her voice in that moment, flat, no tremor, entirely without performance, was apparently enough because the horse stopped. Nobody moved for 3 or 4 seconds. Then from behind her she heard the door open and Clara's voice, small and furious. Mama. Get back inside, Clara. She didn't turn around. There's men in the yard. I see them. Inside. Now. The door shut. She kept the shotgun level and her eyes on the 3 men and thought about the barn burning and the animals inside it and her children behind her, and the 11 days until the hearing and every step that had brought her to this porch, in this cold with this fire going behind her. And she felt something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite calm, but was somewhere in the middle. A steady, hard, entirely awake place inside herself that had been there a long time, but she only found when she needed it. You're going to leave this property, she said. All 3 of you, right now. The man on foot looked at the 2 on horseback. Some communication passed between them that she couldn't read. Ma'am, I will not say it again, she said. A long moment. Then the man on foot took 2 steps back. Then 2 more. One of the horsemen said something low that she couldn't catch, and then all 3 were turning, moving toward the gate, taking their time about it in the way that men do when they want to leave without looking like they've been driven off. She stood on the porch with the shotgun and watched them go through the gate and out onto the road, and she didn't lower the shotgun until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she turned and looked at the barn. Gideon was already there with the bucket line going. He'd gotten the animals out. She could see them in the side pasture, the horses milling and agitated, the cattle further back. Henry was beside him, then Rose appeared with another bucket, and then Ada Kane's husband Rufus was there, which meant Rufus had seen the light from the road and come without being asked, which was the kind of thing that meant something. She went for the water barrel by the side of the house. They fought the fire for 2 hours. They saved most of the barn. The south corner was gone, the frame charred and collapsed, but the north 2/3 held and the animals were safe and the house was untouched. By the time the last of it was out, there were 7 neighbors in the yard, people who'd seen the light from the road or their own windows and come without waiting to be called. Gideon looked at her across the yard when it was done. He was black with soot from the shoulders up, his face stripped down to the plain, exhausted thing underneath all the usual stillness. She probably looked worse. You were right, she said, about this being a fire. He looked at her for a moment. I didn't mean it literally. I know. She looked around at the people in the yard, Rufus and Ada, who'd apparently come with him and was handing out something hot from a pot she'd brought from her kitchen, and 4 other people she'd seen in Harrow Creek and barely spoken to, all of them here in the middle of the night. They thought I'd break, she said. I know. They don't know me very well. He said nothing, but something in his face said he'd noticed that, and that it mattered to him more than the barn did, more than the fire. She went to help Ada with whatever was in the pot. The fire changed something in Harrow Creek. Not immediately. Nothing in a small town changes immediately, because small towns run on the same slow rhythms as the land around them, taking time to absorb things, taking time to decide what they mean. But in the days after the barn burning, Margaret noticed a shift in the quality of attention people paid her when she came into town. Less sideways, more direct. Ada Kane had talked, which meant her husband had talked, which meant the 4 other people who'd shown up with buckets in the middle of the night had talked. And what they said was simple and factual. 3 men had come to the Shaw Ranch and set fire to the barn and tried to frighten a woman into signing papers while her children slept inside, and she'd stood on the porch with a shotgun and sent them off. People had opinions about that. Most of them were the right opinions. Mrs. Gaunt at the general store, who had been one of Prescott's more willing sources of unflattering information about Margaret's circumstances, said nothing directly to Margaret's face when she came in for supplies 4 days after the fire. But she didn't say the other things either, the sideways cutting things, and she wrapped the flour carefully and didn't overcharge, which was its own kind of statement. Celia Brandt heard about the fire by letter from Margaret and arrived on the next stage with an expression that was controlled fury, wearing the mask of professional focus. "Were you hurt?" she said, before she'd taken her coat off. "No." "The children?" "No, frightened. Caleb had nightmares for 2 nights. He's all right now." Brandt sat down and opened her case. "Tell me everything. What the men said, what you said, what they did, who saw it," Margaret told her. All of it, in the order it happened, without editorializing. Brandt wrote while she talked, quick clean notes in a hand that was hard to read but clearly organized. "Rufus and Ada Kane," Margaret said, "and 4 others. All of them saw the men leaving the property." "Did anyone recognize them?" Rufus thought he recognized the man on foot, said he'd seen him twice in the past week in Harrow Creek, coming and going from the Creek Hotel. "Where Prescott is staying," Brandt said. "Where Prescott is staying." Brandt finished her note and looked up. "I want affidavits from all 6 of your witnesses by the day after tomorrow. I want the sheriff notified formally. I'll draft that letter today. And I want Gideon Shaw's account in writing, what he saw when he came out of the barn, what condition the fire was in, where the men were positioned." She paused. "Can you get all of that?" "Yes." "Good." Brandt tapped her pen once on the table. "Victor has made a significant error. He needed you frightened and isolated. Instead, he's given you sympathy and witnesses." She didn't say it with any satisfaction, more like someone noting a change in terrain. "Prescott is good, but he's not stupid. He'll know the fire was a mistake the moment he hears about the affidavits. He'll try to distance Victor from it." "Can he?" "That depends on how clean the connection is. If the men he hired are careful, it'll be difficult to prove Victor ordered it directly." She looked at Margaret. "Which means we don't try to prove it in the hearing. We use it differently." "How?" "We let the jury of public opinion do that work. We let the judge see a woman who has been harassed, threatened, had her property burned, and is still standing in his courtroom asking for nothing more than what's legally hers." Brandt closed her notebook. "You just need to be exactly what you are, Margaret. Don't perform. Don't soften it. Don't try to seem more sympathetic than you already are. Just be the truth." Margaret thought about that for a moment. "I've spent a lot of years trying to seem less threatening than the truth," she said. Brandt looked at her steadily. "I know. Stop that." The 7 days before the hearing had a specific texture she wouldn't forget. She was busy every waking hour, affidavits to collect, documents to review, details to go over with Brandt, the ranch's ordinary work still demanding its ordinary attention because the animals needed feeding and the fence didn't care about courtrooms. She slept badly, woke early, sat at the table in the pre-dawn quiet, and went over things. Gideon was careful with her during those days. Not distant, careful. He gave her space to think without leaving her alone in it, which was a distinction that required a kind of social intelligence she hadn't expected from a man who spoke as sparingly as he did. He made sure there was always coffee. He handled more of the ranch work himself without making a point of it. He answered Brandt's questions about the household's operations in straightforward terms, when Brant sat them down together one evening and went through what the courtroom examination might look like. "They'll ask about your relationship," Brant said, looking between them. "Prescott will try to make it seem like whatever this is," she gestured at the space between them, "is something it isn't, or something it is that you don't want people knowing." "What do we say?" Gideon said. "The truth." "What is the truth?" A short silence. "She needed a place to stay," he said. "I had one. Her children have been working on the ranch. She runs the kitchen and the household." He paused. "It's a practical arrangement." Brant looked at him. "It's also more than that," he said in the same even tone. "But there's nothing improper about it, and nothing I'm ashamed of." Brant looked at Margaret. "I'm not going to lie in a courtroom," Margaret said, "about anything." "Good," Brant said. "Then don't. If Prescott asks whether you have feelings for Gideon Shaw, say yes. If he tries to make that sound like something shameful, let me handle it." She made a note. "Honest people are much harder to cross-examine than careful ones. Careful ones always have a gap somewhere." Margaret looked at the table, then at Gideon, who was looking at his coffee cup. He didn't look up, but the set of his shoulders said he'd registered the moment. She looked away. They had more important things to deal with right now. She could sort out the rest of it after she'd kept her children. The hearing was in Harrow Creek, in the back room of the town hall that served as a courtroom when the circuit judge came through, which was 3 times a year, and never for anything that mattered as much as this one did. Judge Aldrich was a thin man in his 60s with a gray beard and the permanently tired expression of someone who had been listening to people argue for 40 years and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He arrived on the morning stage, ate breakfast at the hotel, and was seated at the bench by 9. The room was full. Margaret had not expected it to be full. She'd expected a small proceeding, lawyers, the judge, herself, Victor. Instead, there were 30 people in the benches, neighbors from Harrow Creek and beyond, some she recognized and some she didn't. Ada Kane was in the second row with Rufus. Prudhomme had ridden up from Cartwright. The 4 other people who'd come to the ranch the night of the fire were clustered near the back. She sat at the table with Brant on her left and looked straight ahead. Victor sat at the opposite table with Prescott. He was dressed well, better than anyone else in the room, and he had the look of a man who believed that being well-dressed in a room full of working people was itself a kind of argument. He didn't look at her when she came in. That was its own statement. Judge Aldrich opened the proceeding with the brisk efficiency of a man working through a schedule. Stated what was before the court, a petition for guardianship of the 6 minor children of the late James Holloway, filed by Victor Holloway, uncle of said children, and asked Prescott to proceed. Prescott was good. She had to give him that. He built his case the way a careful man builds a fire, starting small, patient, each piece placed to support the next. He talked about Margaret's circumstances over the past 14 months, the moves, the reliance on charity, the months with no fixed address. He talked about the children's schooling, which had been interrupted. He talked about the circumstances of the current living situation with a carefully calibrated vagueness that implied everything and stated nothing specific enough to be refuted directly. He brought up the petition's central claim, that a woman in financial instability, living without family support in circumstances the community itself had questioned, was not in a position to make decisions about the significant mineral estate that was now associated with these children. He did not mention the fire. He did not mention the men in the yard. Brant let him finish without objecting to more than 3 or 4 points. She was keeping score of something, Margaret could tell, noting what Prescott was building toward so she could hit the right places when it was her turn. Victor testified first. He was smooth about it. He talked about James, about family, about his genuine concern for his nephews and nieces, whom he'd barely seen in the past year and worried about. He talked about what a good man James had been and how James would have wanted the children properly settled, which was the same thing he'd said on the ranch porch, and Margaret felt the same cold tightness in her chest hearing it again. He said nothing about the land directly. He let it sit in the room like a thing everyone knew was there without anyone needing to point at it. Brant stood up for cross-examination. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "when did you learn about the copper deposit on the land your brother filed claim to?" Prescott objected. Aldrich looked at the objection, looked at Brant, said, "Overruled. Answer the question." Victor's face did something careful. "I became aware of a survey recently. When? Perhaps 6 weeks ago. And when did you file this guardianship petition? A pause. Shortly after. 5 days after, Brant said. You filed this petition 5 days after learning that your late brother's land claim sits on top of a copper deposit that could produce income for the next 30 years. She let that sit for a moment. In the 14 months since your brother died, you contacted his widow twice. Both times you suggested taking the younger children. She glanced at her notes. At no point in those 14 months did you file any legal action regarding the children's welfare. Is that correct? I was giving Margaret time to... Yes or no, Mr. Holloway? Yes, he said tightly. Thank you. Brant moved on without changing her tone. Are you aware of 3 men who came to the Shaw Ranch 11 days ago and set fire to the barn? The room moved. Aldrich looked up. Prescott was on his feet. Objection, relevance. The relevance, Brant said, still looking at Victor, is that my client was threatened on her own property by men who told her she needed to sign papers 11 days before a hearing about her right to custody of her children. I believe that's quite relevant. Aldrich looked at Victor. Do you want to answer that? Victor looked at Prescott. Prescott's face was doing the careful blank thing, but underneath it, Margaret could see the recalibration happening. He hadn't known about the affidavits. He hadn't known how many witnesses had shown up that night. I don't know anything about a fire, Victor said. You don't know the men who came to the Shaw Ranch? I do not. You didn't engage anyone to persuade Mrs. Holloway to cooperate with your petition? Absolutely not. Brant nodded slowly. All right. She turned to the judge. I'd like to call Rufus Kane. Oh, Rufus Kane was not a dramatic man. He was a rancher who talked the way ranchers talk, in short, clear sentences without decoration, and that turned out to be exactly the right way to describe what he'd seen. He'd been coming home late from a neighboring property, he said. He'd seen the light of the fire from the road. He'd come over. He'd seen 2 men on horseback leaving through the gate and a 3rd man on foot moving away along the fence line. He recognized the man on foot because he'd seen him twice that week at the Creek Hotel, coming out of the room registered to Mr. Prescott. Prescott objected 3 times during Rufus's testimony. Aldrich sustained one of them and let the other 2 through. Ada Kane confirmed what her husband had said and added, in the direct measuring way she had, that the man she'd seen was wearing the same gray coat she'd noticed on a man waiting outside the hotel 2 days before the fire, and that she had a very good memory for coats. 2 of the other neighbors testified to what they'd seen when they arrived. One of them, a quiet man named Brannock, who ran sheep about 4 miles east, said he'd heard the horses on the road, 3 of them moving fast, about 20 minutes before he saw the fire glow from his window. Then Brant called Margaret. She sat in the chair and looked at Judge Aldrich and answered Brant's questions in the same straightforward way she'd written the letters, the way she'd stood on the porch with the shotgun, the way she'd done everything for the past 14 months, clearly and without apology. She talked about James, about the mine accident, about the months afterward. She talked about the eviction, the road, the blizzard, Caleb's hypothermia, the ranch. She talked about what her children could do now that they hadn't been able to do a year ago. Henry working cattle, Clara reading to the younger ones every evening, Rose mending tack, Thomas finally keeping track of his own boots. She talked about what stability looked like and what she'd built and what it had cost her. She did not cry. She'd made that decision before she sat down, not because crying was wrong, but because this was not the moment for it. This was the moment for being exactly as clear and solid and present as she actually was. Prescott's cross-examination was careful. He went at the question of the ranch arrangement, trying to find a gap, trying to get her to hedge or qualify or look embarrassed about something she wasn't embarrassed about. You're living on Mr. Shaw's property, he said. A man you met during a blizzard. Yes. And you have feelings for this man. Yes. He paused. He'd expected more resistance. And you don't find it, concerning that this relationship might affect your judgment regarding where to raise your children. My judgment, she said, is that my children are fed, housed, healthy, and safe. My judgment hasn't been wrong. She looked at him directly. Has yours been, Mr. Prescott, regarding the men who came to my ranch? Aldrich made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Prescott moved on. When it was done, when the last witness had sat down and both attorneys had made their closing arguments, and Judge Aldrich had looked at the room over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who'd already made up his mind and was just deciding how to say it. Margaret sat at the table and kept her hands still and waited. Aldrich took 12 minutes. She knew because she counted. He came back and settled himself and looked at his notes, and then at the room, and he said that the petition as filed was based on a premise that the evidence did not support, that Margaret Holloway was an unstable or incapable parent. He said the testimony before the court suggested the opposite. He said the timing of the petition relative to the discovery of the mineral claim was a matter he found significant. He said the events of 11 days prior, as testified to by multiple credible witnesses, reflected a pattern of harassment that raised serious questions about the petitioner's conduct. He denied the petition. He went further. He said the children's inheritance, as defined by James Holloway's properly filed claim, was to be managed by their mother as legal heir and guardian, subject to standard oversight, and that any future challenge to that arrangement would need to meet a substantially higher evidentiary bar than what had been presented today. He banged the gavel once. The room let out a collective breath. Margaret sat very still for a moment. Brant's hand came down on her arm, not squeezed, just rested there. "All right," Brant said quietly. "All right," Margaret said. She turned and looked at the benches. Ada Kane was nodding at her, steady and firm, the way you nod at someone who's done something that needed doing. Rufus had his hat in his lap and a look on his face that said he was satisfied with the world today, which was not a small thing coming from a man who was generally not satisfied with much. Henry was at the back of the room. She hadn't known he was there. She'd left him at the ranch with the others. He must have ridden in on his own, must have been sitting there the whole time, watching. He looked exactly like James in that moment, in the quality of his stillness, in the way he was holding himself, and she held his gaze for a moment before she had to look away. Victor was gathering his things at his table. Prescott was doing the same. Their efficiency had a controlled quality, the efficiency of men who've lost and are not going to stand around acknowledging it publicly. Victor did look at her, once, as he was putting his hat on. Just briefly. His face was not angry. It was something more like the face of a man who's been handed a piece of information he's going to need time to absorb. She didn't look away from him. She waited until he did. Then he walked out. Outside, in the cold that had been there all morning and would be there all afternoon, Gideon was standing by the horses. He'd come into town with her, but hadn't come inside, hadn't been called as a witness, hadn't pushed to be in the room. He was just there, at the hitching post, with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets, and the patient stillness he carried everywhere. He read her face before she said anything. "We won," she said. He nodded once. He denied the petition, all of it. She stopped 2 feet from him. Her voice was steady, but something behind it wasn't, and she let that be true without trying to manage it. "The land is mine. The children are mine. He can't—" She stopped again. "I know," Gideon said. She stood there for a moment in the cold, with everything she'd been holding for 3 weeks sitting on her chest, heavy and strange, and she looked at this man who had given them a fire to walk toward in a blizzard and had not asked for anything specific in return. And she thought about what Brant had said, just be the truth, and decided to apply it here as well. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "For us, I mean. I know what comes next with the land, with the attorneys, with the lease agreement. I don't know—" She stopped. "I'm not good at not knowing things." "I noticed," he said, and the near not-quite smile was there. "I think I'd like to stay," she said, "if that's still something you want." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, and the cold was there, and the horses were patient, and somewhere behind her she could hear people coming out of the town hall, voices and boots on the wooden step. "Yes," he said. "That's still something I want." She let herself take one full breath. Then Henry came out the door behind her and said, "Mama, Caleb's going to be furious he wasn't here." And Margaret turned and looked at her son and felt something come loose in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks, for 14 months. And she said, "He'll survive the disappointment." And Henry almost smiled, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Spring came to the valley the way it always did in Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze, mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes in slow stages like something reluctant to go. The ranch looked different in the light of it. Not transformed, that would be too clean a word for what had happened, but revealed. The way a face looks different when the tension goes out of it and you see what was underneath all along. The south corner of the barn was still partially open to the sky where the fire had taken the timber. They'd covered it with canvas through the worst of the winter, and now in March, with the ground softening, Gideon and Henry were working on rebuilding it properly. She could hear them from the kitchen in the mornings, the sound of hammer and saw, an occasional conversation, the kind that didn't need to be heard in full to be felt. Margaret stood at this kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the yard and thought about the letter that had arrived 2 days ago from the Dalton Mineral Company. Their attorney, a different one from the Chicago end of things, not involved in the legal fight, had proposed a leasing arrangement for the Hill Country claim. Celia Brandt had reviewed it and marked it up with a red pen and sent it back with 3 pages of notes, and the bottom line that the terms were acceptable if they modified clauses 4, 7, and 12. Clause 4 was about the percentage of extraction income. Clause 7 was about the timeline. Clause 12 was about what happened if the vein turned out to be larger than the preliminary survey indicated, which Brandt believed it would. Margaret had read the marked-up contract twice, and then put it in the wooden box with James's letters for one night. Just one night, because she needed to sit with it, with the fact of it, with what it meant that this thing James had quietly believed in without telling her was turning out to be real, was turning out to be exactly what he must have imagined when he set aside those filing fees from his mining wages. She didn't let herself cry about it. She thought about crying and then thought about everything that needed doing and decided that James, of all people, would understand. In the morning, she took the contract out of the box and wrote back to Brandt, "Proceed on your terms." The first payment from Dalton Mineral, representing the signing bonus on the lease agreement, arrived in April. It was more money than Margaret had seen in one place in her entire life. She sat with the bank draft in her hand for about 3 minutes and then took it to the bank in Harrow Creek and opened an account in her name and her children's names together, which the bank manager was not entirely accustomed to but managed. She paid Celia Brandt's full fee. She paid Gideon back for the loan he'd given her in February, which he'd said she didn't need to rush on and which she did anyway, because she needed to. She put the rest in the account and thought about what came next. What came next, she told Gideon that evening, was the barn roof first, then the north fence, which was worse than the south had been. Then she hesitated, which was unusual for her. "What?" he said. "I want to add 2 rooms," she said, "to the house." He looked at her. "We're crowded," she said. "Henry and Thomas are in a space that wasn't really built for 2 adults, much less 2 people of their temperaments, and that's not why you want to add rooms," he said. She stopped. He was leaning back in his chair at the end of the day, his work clothes still on, not pushing her, just looking at her with that patient directness she'd gotten used to over the past 4 months and still couldn't quite anticipate. "No," she said, "it's not only why." "So say the real reason." She looked at her hands on the table. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over, looking at it from different angles the way she looked at legal documents, trying to find the gap, the vulnerability, the place where it went wrong. She hadn't found one. That was both reassuring and unsettling. "I've been thinking about what we do with the extra income," she said, "beyond fixing the ranch, beyond schooling for the children." She paused. "I keep thinking about the road." He waited. "That night," she said, "with Caleb. I think about who we would have been if you hadn't come, where we would have ended up." She looked at him. "I know what it is to have nowhere to go, and I keep looking at this ranch, at how much space there is, at how—" She stopped, frustrated with her own vagueness. She was not a vague person. "There are people like us out there, like I was. Women with children and nowhere and no one. Men who've lost everything and are one bad week from the road. And we have rooms." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You want to take people in?" "Not indefinitely, not a charity house. I mean, a real place to stay while people get their footing. Work for room and board, somewhere someone can land that isn't the bottom." She watched his face. "I know it's your ranch." "It's your home," he said. Those 3 words did something to her that she wasn't prepared for. She'd been careful all this time not to call it that, not to assume, not to presume, not to let herself want something specific enough that losing it would be the particular kind of damage it would be. She'd been managing her own hope the way she managed everything, with both hands and full attention. "You don't have to answer right now," she said. "I'm not waiting to think about it," he said. "I've been waiting for you to say it." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I've been thinking the same thing, about that spare room, about the way Henry has turned out, what that would have looked like if he'd had another year on that road." He looked at his hands. "This ranch has been dying for 5 years. It needs people, not just us." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and thought about what it cost a person to say something like that, to name what had been dying, to admit it plainly. Gideon Shaw was not a man who said things like that easily. She knew that by now. "All right then," she said. He nodded. "We'll need to talk about the other thing too," she said. "Eventually." "I know." "Not tonight." "No," he agreed. "Not tonight." They talked about it 6 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in May, when the children were in various states of outdoor chaos, and the light was going gold across the hills and the barn roof, the real roof, timber and shingles, not canvas, was finished and solid. They talked about it the way two people talk who are both practical and have been circling something for months, which is to say they didn't talk around it at all. Gideon said what he'd been thinking, and she said what she'd been thinking, and it turned out they'd been thinking the same thing, which was not surprising by then. He asked her plainly. She said yes the same way. There was no performance in it. She didn't cry, and he didn't make a speech. He didn't have a ring, he said that directly, said he wanted to get her something proper when they went to Billings next month. And she said she didn't need a ring before she gave him an answer, which he seemed to understand was not a lesser thing, but a larger one. What she remembered most about that evening was not the asking or the answering, but what came after. Going inside to start dinner and listening to her children argue about something in the yard, some dispute between Thomas and Nora about whose turn it was to feed the chickens, and Gideon coming in behind her and standing in the kitchen in a way that was entirely ordinary and entirely new at the same time, and the house feeling not perfect, nothing so clean as that, but inhabited, full, like a thing that had been holding its breath for a long time and had finally decided to breathe. She told the children at dinner. The reactions were, predictably, individual. Clara looked like she'd been expecting it and was choosing how to feel, which was her way with most large things. Rose put her fork down and looked at Gideon for a long moment with the measuring gaze she'd had since she was 4, and then said, "All right," as if she'd been the one asked. Henry didn't say anything. He looked at his plate and then looked at his mother and nodded once, just once, in a way that said he understood what this cost and what it was worth and was not going to interfere with either. Thomas said, "Does that mean we're staying here forever?" "For a long time," Margaret said. "Good," Thomas said, and went back to eating, which was the most complete acceptance she could have hoped for from Thomas. Caleb looked at Gideon with the particular directness of a 7-year-old who had decided something. "You already saved my life," he said. "So that's fine." Nora, who processed things at her own pace, said nothing for the rest of dinner, and then came to Margaret's bedside that night and said carefully, "He's going to be our father?" "He is," Margaret said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "I remember Papa." "I know you do, baby. You always will. Is that okay? To have two?" Margaret looked at her youngest daughter in the dark, at her serious face trying to work out the geography of something that had no simple map. "Yes," she said. "That's okay. People you love don't crowd each other out." Nora thought about that. Then she went back to bed. Nunt. The wedding was in July. Not a large event. Neither of them wanted large. But it wasn't small either because Ada Kane took a personal interest in it, and Ada Kane's personal interests had a way of becoming community events. It was at the ranch, outside, on a Saturday afternoon with the sky clear and the summer grass coming in on the hills. 30 people. Margaret wore a dress that Ada had helped her make. Nothing elaborate, a deep blue that she'd chosen because it was practical enough to wear again, which was the criterion she applied to everything and which Ada had rolled her eyes at before helping her pick a color that suited her. Henry walked her out. He'd asked if he could, quietly, a week before, and she'd said yes without any production around it, and when the moment came, he offered his arm with a formality that was entirely genuine, and she took it, and they walked together across the yard in the summer light. And she thought about James. She thought about James clearly, and without the usual weight of grief, more like thinking about a place you've been that changed you, a thing that was true and was over and had led here, to this, which was also true. Gideon was waiting with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the near smile, not the patient stillness, but something more open than either, slightly anxious and entirely present, which was the most human she'd ever seen him look, and she loved him the most in that moment for it. The judge who married them was a different judge from Aldrich, a younger man named Hooper from Harrow Creek, who did the civil ceremony without fuss. The children sat in the front row in varying states of formality. Caleb had gotten something on his shirt collar already, but sat up straight. Thomas watched the whole thing with the focused attention he gave to things he'd decided were important, which was its own kind of gift. Gideon adopted the children in August. That paperwork was handled by Celia Brandt, who charged Margaret half her usual rate for it, and when Margaret tried to pay the full amount anyway, Brandt sent the difference back with a note that said simply, "Some things I do for the principle of it." All 6 children became Shaw: Henry James Shaw, Clara Margaret Shaw, Rosanna Shaw, Thomas Earl Shaw, Nora Beth Shaw, Caleb William Shaw. She kept Holloway for herself. Margaret Holloway Shaw. She kept it because it was hers and James's both, and she didn't see any reason to let it go, and Gideon had never asked her to. The 2 new rooms were finished by September. One became Henry's, his own space for the first time in his life, which he reacted to with the controlled gratitude of someone who wasn't going to let on how much it mattered, but clearly let on anyway. The other room was kept empty through the fall, with a bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looked west toward the hills. It didn't stay empty long. A woman named Lois Fetter came through in October with 2 sons under 10, and a story that Margaret didn't press for details on because she didn't need the details to recognize the shape of it. She came to the door on a cold afternoon with the boys behind her and the look of someone who'd been told no enough times that they'd stopped expecting yes. Margaret opened the door and looked at her and said, "Are you hungry?" Lois Fetter looked like she might cry. She managed not to. "I don't want charity," she said, in the voice of someone who's said that before and meant it. "It's not charity," Margaret said. "There's a fence that needs painting, and I can't do it myself because I've got 6 children of my own and a ranch to run. $3 a week and room and board while you get sorted. That's a job, not a handout." She stepped back from the door. "Come inside." Lois looked at her for a long moment. "It's cold," Margaret said. "Decide." She came inside. Lois stayed 4 months. When she left in February, she had money saved, a reference letter from Margaret, and a lead on a position in Billings. She cried at the gate, which she also seemed embarrassed about. Margaret handed her a cloth for it without comment. "How do I—" Lois started. "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said. "You worked for what you got, but if you come across someone who needs this—" She gestured at the ranch. "Send them here." She did. They all did, in the end. Over the years that followed, and they did follow, the way years do when people build something real in a place that was trying to go empty, the spare room rarely stayed unused for long. A young man running from a bad situation in Wyoming who turned out to be good with horses and stayed 8 months before moving on better than he'd arrived. A widow with an infant who needed 6 weeks and got them. 2 brothers who'd been turned out of a failed homestead and needed nothing more than a winter to regroup, and repaid it in labor that finished the last of the fencing and started a kitchen garden that Margaret had been meaning to start for 2 years. Not all of them were easy. One man took something from the barn when he left, and Margaret never knew for certain who it had been, which made her angry in a slow way that lasted longer than she liked. A woman who came through in the spring of the 3rd year was difficult, demanding in ways that wore on everyone, ungrateful in a way that felt like something broken underneath rather than simple selfishness. And Margaret and Gideon had a genuine argument about it one night when the children were asleep, voices low but real, the kind of argument that comes from both people caring about something and seeing it differently. She wanted to give the woman more time. He thought they'd given enough. They disagreed for 3 days, and then the woman left on her own and the question resolved itself, which is sometimes the only resolution available. She thought about that a long time afterward, about what she'd said in that argument and what he'd said and whether either of them had been entirely right, and she decided they'd both been about half right, which is usually how it goes. That was the marriage, mostly. Two people who were good at different things, occasionally bad at the same things, paying attention, staying. The children grew. Henry turned 17 and then 18, and then was a man, genuinely, the kind of man you notice has become what they were going to be. Quiet like Gideon, but warmer underneath. His father's hands and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that served him well. He took on more of the ranch and gradually, without it ever being formally decided, became the person who ran the cattle operation day to day, while Gideon stepped back into the wider management of things. Clara read her way through every book Margaret could get to her, and when the school teacher in Harrow Creek moved away, it was Clara who took the position, at 19, because she was better qualified than anyone else who applied, and because she wanted it, and because Ada Kane personally recommended her to the school board in terms that left the board little room to disagree. She taught for 3 years and then went to Butte to study further, which was hard. The first child to leave was always going to be hard, but Margaret had learned to hold things without squeezing them to death, and she let Clara go with a real goodbye and none of the clinging underneath that she felt and chose not to act on. Rose became a person who fixed things. Whatever was broken, a saddle, a fence, a piece of farm equipment, eventually other people's equipment when word got around about her skill, Rose attended to it with a focus and a competence that she seemed entirely unbothered by, as if the work were simply the obvious response to a problem. She had her mother's directness and none of her mother's tolerance for bad faith, which meant she did not suffer nonsense and never pretended to. Margaret considered this a great success. Thomas, who had spent his early years in mild continuous disaster, turned out to be the one who understood people. He had an instinct for it, for what a person meant under what they said, for what was actually wrong when someone said nothing was wrong, for the right thing to say in the specific silence that needed filling. Margaret suspected he'd been learning it his whole life in the way children do, watching the adults around them navigate hard things, absorbing the pattern. He was not easy, exactly. He was never easy. But he was good in the way that matters most, which is being good toward people when they need it. Nora grew up into a young woman who said less than anyone expected and was right more often than anyone accounted for, and who eventually became the family's memory, the one who remembered what year things had happened and what people had actually said, and who had been the first to notice when something was wrong. She wrote things down, eventually. Not for any audience, just for the keeping of it, which was, Margaret thought, one of the most essential things a person could do. And Caleb, who had been small and cold and still in a blizzard at 7 years old, whose feet she'd held against her ribs on a road she wasn't sure had an end, grew up loud and warm and argumentative and kind, and had Gideon's steadiness in him somewhere underneath all the noise, and would argue with you about anything and then do exactly what needed doing when it counted. He was the one who drove her to distraction most consistently and whom she probably loved the most completely in the helpless way you love the thing that costs you the most, which is not something she said to any of the others. Boo! The Hill Country claim produced for 22 years before the main vein began to thin. By then it had funded schooling, repairs, the spare room's rotating population, a second horse barn, Clara's education, Thomas's eventual work elsewhere, and a savings account that Margaret reviewed quarterly with the methodical satisfaction of a woman who'd spent years with nothing and had never forgotten what that felt like. Dalton Mineral renegotiated the lease twice. Both times, Celia Brandt handled it. The third negotiation, Brandt was retired and Margaret handled it herself, and Dalton Mineral's new attorney called her a formidable negotiator, which she took as accurate rather than a compliment. She and Gideon were sitting on the porch on a September evening, years into their life together, the age having settled onto them the way it does, the way you sometimes look at someone you've known a long time and see all the versions of them at once, the younger one underneath the present one. When she asked him something she'd been turning over for a while. "Do you think James knew?" she said. He didn't have to ask what she meant. About the copper? About all of it. What it would turn into. He thought about it for a long moment. That was still his way. He still took time with things that deserved time. I think he knew the land was worth something. He believed it enough to file. He looked out at the hills. The rest, I think he just wanted to leave you something to stand on. She sat with that. He did, she said, after a while. He did, Gideon agreed. The girl arrived on a Tuesday in October, 12 years after Margaret and Gideon had married. She came up the road on foot in the early evening with a coat that wasn't warm enough for the weather and a bag that had clearly been packed in a hurry. She was perhaps 19, possibly younger, with the particular quality of stillness that people have when they've been frightened for long enough that stillness has become a survival strategy. She stopped at the gate. She'd clearly seen the smoke from the chimney and come toward it the way people do when the cold is making decisions for them. But now she was standing there in that moment between needing something and not knowing how to ask for it, which Margaret recognized because she'd stood in it herself. Gideon was on the porch. He'd come out to check the sky. A weather habit of his, 20 years on a Montana ranch, had made him read clouds the way other people read text. He saw her at the gate and came down the porch steps. The girl looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd had reasons to be wary of men, which was its own kind of information. He stopped a few feet short of crowding her. He looked at her the way he looked at frightened things, horses, children, anyone arriving at the end of their rope, with a patience that had nothing to prove. "Come with me now," he said. 4 words. The same 4 words he'd said to a woman on a frozen road with a dying child in her arms, all those years ago. The girl looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the house, at the warm light in the window, at the sound that was coming from inside. Voices, a scrape of chair, someone laughing at something, the ordinary noise of a full house. She picked up her bag and came through the gate. Margaret was at the window. She'd seen the whole thing. She watched the girl come across the yard and Gideon walking beside her, and she went to put the kettle on. This was the thing she'd learned in the end. Not the legal truth, not that strength means standing on a porch with a shotgun while your barn burns behind you, though that was true enough. Not the practical truth, not that you survived by not stopping, though that was true too. The deeper thing, the one that took years to understand, was simpler and harder than both. Nobody gets themselves to solid ground entirely alone. Not really. Somewhere in everyone's story there is a lantern in a blizzard, a door that opened, a fire that was already going when you arrived and didn't ask how long you'd stay before you'd warmed up. The people who received that, who were picked up out of the cold and handed a cup of something hot and told, "Don't worry about it tonight," had a choice about what they did with it. They could hold it close and call it luck and move on. Or they could understand that the debt wasn't to the person who'd helped them. The debt was forward, owed to the next person standing at the gate. She'd been standing at her own gate once, cold and proud, and not sure she could ask for what she needed. Someone had said, "Come with me now." She put the cups out. She heard the door open. She heard Gideon say something low and the girl say something back. The careful short sentences of someone who hasn't decided yet whether to trust a place but is too cold to leave. "Sit down," Margaret said, without turning from the stove. "There's tea, and I'll get something on for dinner." She glanced back at the girl, young, scared, holding her bag like she might need to pick it up fast. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight. There's a room. There's work if you want it." The girl looked at her. "What's your name?" Margaret said. A pause. Then, "Elsa." "Elsa." Margaret turned back to the stove. "You're all right now." The kettle began to sing. Outside, the October dark was coming down over the hills, and the ranch sat in the light of its own windows the way things that have been built carefully sit. Not perfectly, never perfectly, with its repaired barn and its mismatched fences and its spare room and its full table. Solid. Real. A place someone had fought for and won, and chosen to make into something beyond what surviving required. The kind of place that becomes in time what a light in a blizzard looks like from the road.